The strategic landscape of the Pacific War in the summer of 1942 was defined by a fragile, shifting equilibrium that was entirely unprecedented in the history of modern naval warfare. The Imperial Japanese Navy had suffered a catastrophic defeat at the Battle of Midway in early June, losing 4 fleet carriers and the core of its elite naval aviation arm. However, despite this monumental setback, the Japanese Empire's territorial expansion remained largely unchecked in the South Pacific. The Japanese High Command, operating under the strategic directives of the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, sought to completely sever the vital sea lines of communication between the United States and Australia. By advancing relentlessly down the Solomon Islands chain, their objective was to establish a network of forward air bases that would allow their formidable land-based bombers, such as the Mitsubishi G4M Betty, to project power across the Coral Sea and isolate the Australian continent from American logistical support. In early July 1942, Allied intelligence, aided by Australian coast watchers hidden deep in the jungles, detected the construction of a significant airfield on the northern coast of an obscure, deeply inhospitable, and jungle-choked island named Guadalcanal. This single piece of intelligence triggered a chain of events that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of the Second World War. The American response, codenamed Operation Watchtower, was the first major Allied amphibious offensive of the war, aimed directly at seizing this airfield before it could become operational and threaten the Allied supply lines. The subsequent Japanese attempts to retake the airstrip, culminating in the massive, bloody offensive against Henderson Field in October 1942, represent one of the most profound strategic and tactical blunders in the history of the Japanese military. The relentless, obsessive attacks on America's Henderson Field were not merely a series of localized tactical defeats. They constituted a massive, systemic mistake that bled the Imperial Japanese Army dry, consumed irreplaceable naval and aviation assets, and permanently transferred the strategic initiative of the Pacific War to the United States. To comprehend the absolute magnitude of this mistake, one must first deeply examine the inherent, almost gravitational value of the airfield itself, and the horrific environment in which it was located. The island of Guadalcanal is a profoundly hostile environment, characterized by suffocating humidity that rarely drops below 90%, dense triple canopy rainforests that block out the sun, fields of razor-sharp kanai grass that can grow taller than a man, and a pervasive, inescapable presence of debilitating tropical diseases such as malaria, dengue fever, scrub typhus, and dysentery. The island possesses almost no intrinsic economic, political, or natural resource value. Its entire strategic worth was concentrated entirely in a small patch of relatively flat, defensible ground situated on the Lunga Plain near the northern coast. When the 1st Marine Division, under the command of Major General Alexander Vandegrift, landed on August 7, 1942, they achieved total tactical surprise and seized the partially completed Japanese airstrip with minimal opposition. The Marines, recognizing that their very survival depended on air cover, immediately set to work finishing the runway using captured Japanese equipment, naming it Henderson Field in honor of Major Lofton R. Henderson, a Marine aviator who had perished leading an attack at Midway. From the exact moment the first American aircraft, a mixed squadron of Marine F-4F Wildcat fighters and SBD Dauntless dive bombers, touched down on the rutted, muddy dirt runway on August 20th, Henderson Field became the unyielding, bloody focal point of the entire Guadalcanal campaign. The aircraft operating from this crude, constantly bombarded strip, collectively known as the Cactus Air Force, established absolute daytime air superiority over the waters surrounding Guadalcanal, an area of the ocean known as the slot. This air superiority meant that Japanese transport ships, which were slow and highly vulnerable, could not safely approach the island during daylight hours without facing certain annihilation from the bombs and machine guns of the Dauntlesses and Wildcats. Consequently, the Japanese were forced into a terrible logistical compromise. They had to rely on the Tokyo Express, a system of using fast, heavily armed destroyers to sprint down the slot at night under the cover of darkness, rapidly offload troops and supplies in the surf, and flee back north before the sun rose and the American planes returned to the sky. While this method allowed the Japanese to steadily build up infantry numbers on the island, it was disastrously inefficient for delivering the heavy implements of modern war. Artillery pieces, tanks, massive stockpiles of ammunition, medical supplies, and critically, food, could not be efficiently unloaded in the dark from warships that were not designed for cargo transport. The Japanese soldiers fighting on Guadalcanal were thus chronically undersupplied, severely malnourished, and utterly lacking the heavy firepower necessary to dislodge deeply entrenched American marine positions. The very existence of Henderson Field dictated the logistical terms of the campaign, forcing the Japanese into a paradigm of starvation and deprivation. By failing to recognize the insurmountable disadvantage this logistical strangulation created, the Japanese High Command committed their forces to a grinding, inescapable war of attrition they were fundamentally unequipped to win. The hubris of the Imperial Japanese Army played a critical, fatal role in the cascading disasters that unfolded around the perimeter of Henderson Field. Prior to Guadalcanal, the Japanese Army had experienced a nearly unbroken string of stunning victories across Asia and the Pacific, sweeping through Malaya, Singapore, the Philippines, and the Dutch East Indies with terrifying speed. They had developed a profound, almost religious belief in their own spiritual superiority and the invincible nature of the Japanese infantryman's fighting spirit, known as Yamato Damashi. This ideological conditioning led to a fatal, systemic underestimation of the combat capabilities, resolve, and firepower of the United States Marines. The initial Japanese counterattacks in August and September 1942, specifically the Battle of the Tenarue River and the Battle of Edson's Bloody Ridge, were characterized by piecemeal, unsupported frontal assaults against heavily prepared American defenses. The Japanese commanders truly believed that sheer shock, aggression, and terrifying nighttime bayonet charges would shatter American morale, which they perceived as weak and overly reliant on material comfort. Instead of a routing enemy, they met a buzzsaw of interlocking water-cooled machine gun fire, concentrated and perfectly registered artillery barrages, and unyielding, brutal marine discipline. Despite these early, phenomenally bloody failures, the Japanese 17th Army, commanded from Rabaul by Lieutenant General Harukichi Hyakutake, categorically refused to alter their fundamental tactical doctrine. They simply, and disastrously, concluded that they had not used enough men in their previous attempts, setting the stage for a much larger tragedy. This incredibly flawed reasoning and refusal to adapt set the stage for the massive October offensive, which was envisioned as the ultimate, decisive attempt to destroy Henderson Field and drive the American forces into the sea once and for all. General Hyakutake committed the elite, battle-hardened 2nd Division, also known as the Sendai Division, commanded by Lieutenant General Masao Maruyama, alongside significant elements of the 38th Division. The plan developed by the Japanese staff was highly ambitious, incredibly complex, and fatally disconnected from the brutal physical realities of the Guadalcanal terrain. The Japanese strategy called for a massive, multi-pronged assault designed to confuse and overwhelm the American defenders. A diversionary force under the command of Major General Tadashi Sumiyoshi would attack the American western flank along the Matanakaw River, supported by a detachment of tanks and whatever heavy artillery they had managed to land. Meanwhile, the main body of the 2nd Division, numbering roughly 7,000 heavily armed men under General Maruyama, would execute a wide, sweeping flanking maneuver deep through the jungle to the south, aiming to strike the supposedly unprotected southern perimeter of Henderson Field. The attack was scheduled to be a perfectly synchronized, devastating blow that would overrun the airfield, slaughter the American aviation personnel, and signal the massive Japanese combined fleet, waiting just over the horizon, to sail in and destroy the remaining American naval forces in the area. The execution of this grand plan, however, immediately devolved into a masterclass in military disaster and logistical failure. The most glaring, unforgivable error was the Japanese High Command's total underestimation of the jungle itself. The route chosen for Maruyama's main assault force, which the Japanese optimistically dubbed the Maruyama Road, was not a road by any stretch of the human imagination. It was a barely passable track hacked blindly through some of the most unforgiving, topologically chaotic terrain on planet Earth. The jungle south of Henderson Field was a nightmare of steep, muddy ravines, slick limestone ridges, dense, impenetrable vines, and an oppressive, stagnant heat that drained the life from the marching men. The Japanese soldiers, who were already physically weakened by drastically reduced rations and the onset of malaria, were forced to carry their weapons, ammunition, and survival supplies on their backs. The grand plan initially called for the troops to literally drag mountain guns and heavy field artillery through this jungle to support the final assault. Within mere days of beginning the march, the harsh reality of the terrain forced the Japanese to abandon their heavy weapons. The artillery pieces, absolutely essential for softening up reinforced American bunkers and suppressing interlocking machine gun nests, were left rusting in the mud, abandoned to the jungle. The elite 2nd Division arrived at their assembly areas south of Henderson Field utterly exhausted, starving, organizationally fragmented, and completely stripped of their heavy fire support. The jungle had effectively neutralized the striking power of an entire Japanese division before a single shot had been fired at the American lines. Furthermore, the extreme complexity of the Japanese plan required precise coordination and exact timing, an absolute impossibility given the lack of adequate radio communications equipment, the thick jungle canopy that absorbs sound, and the isolating, disorienting nature of the environment. The diversionary attack at the Matanakaw River, intended to draw American reserves away from the southern perimeter where Maruyama would strike, was launched prematurely on October 23. General Sumiyoshi's forces, lacking any meaningful coordination with Maruyama's severely delayed main body, launched a massive frontal assault across the river mouth. The attack was spearheaded by a company of Type 97 Kai-Ha and Type 95 Ha-Go tanks, lightly armored vehicles that were entirely unsuited for the dense terrain. The Marines of the 1st Battalion, 7th Marines, supported by devastatingly accurate 37mm anti-tank guns and 75mm half-tracks, obliterated the armored thrust with ruthless efficiency. The Japanese tanks were systematically destroyed, burning on the sandbar, and the accompanying infantry was decimated by massed Marine artillery fire that churned the riverbanks into a slaughterhouse. The Matanakaw diversion failed completely, resulting in horrific Japanese casualties while failing to draw any significant Marine reserves away from the southern perimeter. Instead of weakening the American lines, it merely alerted the American command that a major, coordinated offensive was underway, causing them to double their watch and prepare their defenses. Meanwhile, General Maruyama's main force was still struggling desperately through the jungle darkness. The attack, originally scheduled for October 22, was delayed repeatedly due to the impassable terrain, horrific weather, and catastrophic navigational errors. When the assault finally materialized on the pitch-black night of October 24, it was directed squarely at a sector of the southern perimeter defended by the 1st Battalion, 7th Marines, commanded by the legendary Lieutenant Colonel Louis Chesty Puller, and the 2nd Battalion, 164th Infantry Regiment, a freshly arrived U.S. Army National Guard unit from North Dakota that had been integrated into the Marine lines. The Japanese tactical plan relied entirely on the elements of surprise and overwhelming nighttime infiltration, tactics that had worked exceedingly well in the jungles of Malaya and the Philippines against less prepared forces. However, on Guadalcanal, the Americans had established a continuous, deeply entrenched, and highly sophisticated defensive line. The perimeter was protected by dense belts of double-apron barbed wire, hidden trip flares, and meticulously sighted interlocking fields of fire for their heavy M1917 water-cooled machine guns and M1919 light machine guns. Behind the infantry, Marine artillery battalions had pre-registered every likely avenue of approach, ready to drop walls of high explosives and shrapnel at a moment's notice. The Japanese assault on the night of October 24 was a chilling testament to the tragic, misguided bravery of the Japanese infantrymen and the uncompromising, industrial lethality of American defensive firepower. Maruyama's troops burst from the jungle edge in torrential, blinding rain, screaming blood-curdling battle cries and charging directly into the teeth of the American lines. They were instantly met by a solid wall of lead, tracers, and high explosives. The American machine guns fired with such sustained, frantic intensity that the water jackets boiled over, and the gunners suffered severe burns changing out glowing hot barrels in the dark. It was during this desperate nighttime struggle that Marine Sergeant John Basilone earned the Medal of Honor, commanding 2 heavy machine gun sections that held the line against repeated, fanatical human wave attacks, continuously repairing jammed guns in the dark and running through intense enemy fire to resupply his men with belts of ammunition. The Japanese, stripped of their artillery during their jungle march, had absolutely no way to suppress the American bunkers or counter the artillery. They threw themselves mindlessly against the barbed wire, their bodies piling up so high that subsequent waves of attackers used the dead as ramps to cross the obstacles, only to be cut down themselves. Despite the staggering, incomprehensible losses, the Japanese 2nd Division commanders stubbornly adhered to their original orders, launching wave after wave of frontal assaults into the exact same designated kill zones. The tactical inflexibility of the Japanese officer corps, deeply rooted in a culture that viewed retreat or deviation from orders as a supreme dishonor, was a fatal flaw. When the initial assaults were shattered, there was absolutely no attempt to probe for weaker sectors along the perimeter or alter the axis of advance to find an opening. The doctrine of the spiritual charge demanded that the objective be taken through sheer willpower, regardless of the physical reality of American automatic weapons and artillery. By the morning of October 25, the area south of Henderson Field was a literal charnel house. Thousands of Japanese soldiers lay dead or dying in the deep mud, hopelessly tangled in the barbed wire, or cut to pieces in the cleared firing lanes. The Marines and Army troops, though exhausted and depleted, had held the line, their strict fire discipline and vastly superior firepower totally neutralizing the Japanese numerical advantage and fighting spirit. The disaster compounded exponentially on the night of October 25, when General Maruyama, utterly refusing to accept defeat or acknowledge the reality of the situation, ordered his remaining, battered reserves to attack the exact same positions again. The result was tragically identical: a localized, systematic slaughter of elite Japanese infantry by heavily entrenched American defenders. The Marine artillery, utilizing forward observers who bravely called down fire missions to within mere yards of their own lines, created impenetrable, deafening curtains of shrapnel that decimated the Japanese staging areas in the jungle before the attacks could even gain any forward momentum. By the morning of October 26, the great Japanese offensive had completely collapsed. The Sendai Division, one of the proudest units in the Imperial Japanese Army, had been effectively destroyed as a coherent fighting force, suffering over 3,000 dead in a matter of days. The survivors, broken in spirit, physically starving, and ravaged by disease, began a harrowing, nightmarish retreat back into the deep jungle, where thousands more would succumb to untreated wounds, malaria, and starvation in the terrible weeks to come, a retreat that the Japanese soldiers themselves referred to as the Death March. The October offensive against Henderson Field was a monumental mistake because it demonstrated a complete, systemic failure of Japanese strategic and operational intelligence. The Japanese High Command continually, arrogantly underestimated the number of American troops on the island, the high quality of their defensive preparations, the volume of their logistical supply, and the sheer effectiveness of their combined arms doctrine. By focusing obsessively, almost pathologically, on capturing the airfield through unsupported ground assaults, the Japanese allowed themselves to be drawn into a battle of pure attrition on the enemy's terms. They fed their best, most experienced infantry divisions into an industrial meat grinder, perfectly positioned at the end of a long, highly vulnerable logistical tether, while the Americans fought from a consolidated, heavily defended central position with internal lines of communication and immense firepower. The Japanese strategy was the equivalent of repeatedly bashing one's head against a brick wall, hoping the wall would break before the skull did. Furthermore, the obsession with retaking Henderson Field had devastating, far-reaching consequences for the Imperial Japanese Navy. While Maruyama's infantry was bleeding to death in the mud of the jungle, the combined fleet, commanded by Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, was maneuvering in the waters north of Guadalcanal, desperately waiting for the predetermined signal that the airfield had fallen so they could move in safely and destroy the American fleet. The resulting naval engagement, the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands, which took place from October 25 to 27, was a massive, violent carrier clash that, while technically a tactical Japanese victory in terms of ships sunk, including the loss of the American aircraft carrier USS Hornet, was strategically disastrous for the future of Japan. The Japanese Navy lost over 90 highly experienced, veteran naval aviators in the battle. This was a loss of irreplaceable institutional knowledge and combat skill that permanently crippled the striking power of their carrier force. The elite air groups that had devastated Pearl Harbor, sunk the Royal Navy in the Indian Ocean, and won the early battles of the Pacific were effectively, permanently wiped out trying to support a flawed ground offensive that had already catastrophically failed. The Japanese could build replacement aircraft, but they could not replace the thousands of hours of training and experience those dead pilots possessed. The immediate aftermath of the October offensive marked the absolute turning point of the Guadalcanal campaign and, arguably, the entire Pacific War. The Japanese had expended their maximum possible effort, committed their finest troops and ships, and failed completely. The loss of elite, combat-hardened veterans in the 2nd and 38th Divisions could never be replaced by the increasingly strained and rushed Japanese training pipeline back to home islands. The myth of the invincible Japanese infantryman, built upon years of easy success in China and Southeast Asia, was permanently shattered on the bloody barbed wire south of Henderson Field. The American forces, conversely, gained immense, unshakable confidence. They had proven definitively that they could withstand the most fanatical, terrifying Japanese attacks, and the successful integration of Marine and Army units validated American tactical doctrine and joint operational capabilities. From November 1942 onwards, the Japanese forces on Guadalcanal were entirely on the defensive, their situation degrading daily. Their efforts shifted entirely from trying to retake the airfield to simply trying to keep their starving, disease-ridden garrison alive long enough to evacuate them. The Cactus Air Force at Henderson Field grew stronger with every passing week, projecting power further and further up the slot, effectively isolating the major Japanese bases at Rabaul and Bougainville. The eventual Japanese evacuation of Guadalcanal in February 1943, codenamed Operation K, was a brilliant, stealthy tactical withdrawal, but it was merely the final, desperate act of a catastrophic strategic failure. They had lost the island, they had lost tens of thousands of their best men, and they had lost the initiative. The decision by the Japanese High Command to repeatedly attack Henderson Field was a huge mistake because it fundamentally misunderstood the true nature of the industrial, mechanized, modern war that the United States was prepared and uniquely equipped to fight. The Japanese military doctrine relied entirely on fighting spirit, the element of surprise, and the terror of the bayonet charge. The Americans, on the other hand, relied on massive logistical chains, massed artillery, overwhelming air superiority, and the ruthless, mathematical application of overwhelming firepower. By attacking the strongest, most heavily fortified point of the American perimeter with starved, unsupported infantry lacking artillery or air cover, the Japanese command committed a profound dereliction of military duty to their own men. Henderson Field stands in history as a stark, bloody testament to the fatal consequences of military hubris, poor logistical planning, and the stubborn refusal to adapt to changing tactical realities on the battlefield. The blood soaked into the dark soil of the Lunga Plain bought the United States the strategic initiative, an overwhelming advantage they would never relinquish as they began the long, relentless, island-hopping drive across the vast expanse of the Pacific toward the Japanese home islands. The obscure dirt airstrip that was meant to secure the southern flank of the expanding Japanese Empire instead became the unbreakable anvil upon which its offensive capabilities were systematically, violently hammered into dust, proving that in the brutal calculus of total war, sheer willpower can never overcome industrial might and entrenched firepower.